This podcast is recorded on stolen and unceded Aboriginal land.
We acknowledge the First Nations and elders of this country and join their calls for justice. Always was, always will be Aboriginal land. All right, let's start with some lighter news. The Doomsday clock has moved closer to midnight. In chilling warning, apocalypse is seconds away. I saw you tweet about this, Amy Remeikis. Are you worried about the Doomsday clock? Oh no, it looks like maybe the world isn't in a good place.
Yeah, I'm like, I think it's actually like way past fucking midnight. Why are we even pretending that the Doomsday clock is something? Oh, we're 89 seconds closer to midnight. Oh, I think that was passed somewhere in 2012. So could we stop pretending that this is some sort of measure of like, you know, humanity and how close we are to danger? We're there. It's now. Mama's tired. She's got to go take off her heels, go into bed. It's been a great night, but, you know, she's turning into a pumpkin. Let's move on.
89 seconds seems like heaps of time. We've got heaps of time to do something to sort of avoid destruction, but I don't think we have that amount of time.
No, I don't think we do. And that's some of my problem with, you know, how a lot of like, you know, the climate stuff is framed, because it's always like, do it for the kids, do it for the future. No, do it for now. Like, do it now for now, because we're literally just trying to stop things getting any worse than they currently are. Like, the LA bushfires, the Australian bushfires from a couple of years ago, the floods, like all of that is the normal now. We're trying to stop it from getting worse than that. Yeah. So like, do it now for now. Let's not wait the next 89 seconds.
I mean, again, you only just hear these headlines pop up every now and again. And you're like, oh, that's right, the Doomsday clock exists.
I just like to think of these boffins just sitting there, staring at this clock, being all like, how much time do we have left? Oh, God. Oh, it looks like there's fascists in the White House. Let's move that forward a second.
Click. But I don't know just the scientific I'm sure, look, I could have researched this and looked into the scientific process of the thinking that goes into it, to what determines when we move things closer or further away. But the history is a little wild. The Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists, which set up the clock at the start of the Cold War, shifted the clock to 89 seconds to midnight, the closest it has ever been a week after Trump's inauguration. The clock was last moved to 90 seconds to midnight over nuclear-armed Russia's invasion of Ukraine in 2022. It was originally placed at 7 minutes to midnight in 1947. Okay, so in 1947, we had 7 minutes away from apocalypse, nuclear disaster, and we're down to 89 seconds to go.
Yeah, cool. We're going really, really well. Just 2 thumbs up for humanity. Really excited about all of this. Honestly, though, like, look, I get it that it makes a great headline, but when I saw that, I was just like, are we really still doing this? Like, the world is literally on fire. We are all the dog with the cup of coffee going, you know, this is fine, but we are also on fire now. Like, it is way past looking.
The dog
is on fire. And we're all living in garbage cans. There's no actual walls in our house. Like, it's just, I mean, I know that we try as humans to rationalize these sorts of things, but like 89 seconds to midnight, like, come on. Like, and even the photos of like these people standing around this clock with very concerned looks on their faces. Oh yeah, that's got to fix it. That's definitely going to fix something. Dr. Clock, thank you very much for the reminder.
It's not even a full fucking clock. They just have like, it's like 1/4 of the clock. And then the hand's almost.
And I mean, like, I'm sorry, but in terms of nuclear annihilation, what does 89 seconds actually get us? Like, how much time do we have to get into the bunker in 89 seconds? Like, you're basically just turning around and just being all like, oh, well, that was a ride.
But also, we're not, I mean, I know things are terrible at the moment. Are we closer to nuclear war now than we were at the height of the Cold War? Really?
No, and are we any closer to nuclear war under Trump than we were under Biden? Like, I mean, like, Trump is an absolute psychopath and he is surrounded by absolute narcissistic psychopaths. But has anyone actually looked at American, like, global policy? Like, even under the Democrats? Like, it's not that much of a joke to be all like, the Democrats are just still like bombs, but with rainbow flags. Like, it's just, It is kind of crazy to me that people are feeling so much anxiety over Trump, and that anxiety is reasonable and it's rational, and I get that. But you also probably should have felt anxiety under Biden and under Obama and under the Clintons, because occasionally you get the mask off with the Bushes and the Trumps and, all the Reagans and all of that. But they're literally just continuing policy that already exists under Democratic presidents. So, what are you actually worried about? The fact that the guy who you know to be a psychopath is in charge of that policy that is already having massive impacts across the world and, is responsible for all sorts of horror? Or is it that you didn't really think about the horror because the guy before that had some better quips and a better wardrobe?
Oh, you're talking about Obama, not Biden.
So Obama, I mean, Biden had these aviators or whatever.
The last thing I would ever attribute to Joe Biden is quips.
Well, he tried, right? He did try. I'm sure he's still finishing a sentence that he started in 2018.
He tried it. That's all you can do, guys, is try.
Yeah, you try to bomb the Middle East, it's just he's just a baby girl just doing his best in a complex global situation.
50-cent public transport fares. Now, it might send Queensland broke. It's smashing the budget there. I ride trams around all the time. I see nobody paying. So I don't know what the Greens are on about.
We're stuck with the hosts of Chapo Shithouse podcast.
Serious danger to Australia.
Let's try and do a podcast. This is Serious Danger, a podcast about green politics in Australia. It is not an official Greens Party podcast. It is made possible with the help of the Green Institute and produced by Michael the Griff Griffin. I am Tom Ballard, coming to you from the lands of the Wurundjeri and Boonwurrung people on Kulin Country. Emerald is off this week, but once again, delighted to be joined by a very special guest co-host, the Chief Political Analyst, at the Australia Institute. You, of course, know her work through The Guardian. She's at the Australia Institute these days. Amy Remeikis, welcome back.
Thank you. It's a very fancy title, isn't it?
And Chief Political Analysis.
It's quite fancy, and also just kind of bullshit. I just kind of look at politics and go, "This is all shit." That's my job.
Are there political analysts who will work under you that are your minions that you get to tell how to analyze politics?
I am chief and sole political analyst, and very, very often the stupidest person in the room at my workplace. So that's a nice position to be in.
Good. Well, I guess if you're the only person there, then you can't get fired if you're in charge of doing that yourself. That's good.
True, and I'm the only person who's exclusively looking at politics, which is one of the reasons I'm the stupidest person in the room. So. Oh,
you mean day-to-day cut and thrust of politics? Everyone else is doing policy bits and pieces, but you're talking about
everyone's working on changing the world, and I'm all like, wow, Susan Ley just related Australia's colonisation to Elon Musk wanting to colonise Mars. Guys, anyone?
We didn't do that. I mean, last week's episode, we had Lydia Thorpe. We did a big January 26 chat. I think that one must have got through the wire after our recording. That was a particularly bonkers contribution from Susan Ley. Again, giving a speech, yes, comparing the colonisation of Australia to what Elon Musk wants to do on Mars, being presented with a hostile environment. Is she suggesting that there would be indigenous populations on Mars that we would then colonise and occupy and dispossess?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I guess to the Mars, people, if they exist and we haven't found them yet, we are the aliens. We are the colonizing aliens coming into Mars and just taking over all those microbiomes, I suppose, just stomping all over it. It's exactly the same as what happened to Indigenous people in Australia. Susan Ley, she's just doing 4D thinking, really. It's just galaxy brain, and we just haven't caught up.
Wonderful
this
stuff.
Is a woman, it has to be always remembered, who added an S to her name for better numerology results. That is true. Look it up.
Pretty awesome. Just quickly, too, we talked a bit about the polling of public sentiment in regards to our National Day last week with Lydia. Again, after we recorded it, there was an extra poll. I think it might have been Resolve Monitor, or certainly being reported in the 9 Fairfax papers. That was, depressing a lot of people, because I think it showed 2021 the level of support for changing the date of the National Day compared to now had changed significantly. That is, people seemed to be much more invested in Australia Day remaining on January 26th in 2024. The polling had swung away from the idea of changing the date whatsoever to quite a significant margin. What did you make of that?
I think that's just that is just a comment on where we are in the conversation in general. Like after the voice referendum and how the voice referendum was run, people just feel very emboldened now to say the quiet part out loud of things that they've probably already thought. And I don't think a lot of people actually put a lot of thought into how distressing January 26 is for First Nations people. I mean, just being the only nation in the world to celebrate our colonisation date. And then you'll often have those people who come back and say, oh, well, it's actually celebrating the date we broke away from the UK and became Australian citizens with the Australia Act. Politicians choose the dates that legislation is enacted. Yeah, I mean, like they chose January 6th because it was the day when they raised the flag, right? So it was a particular date that they chose on purpose. And all of this debate that has been hijacked by, the Temu Trumps who were running around Australia basically just trying to bring every single culture war. They're taking the voice referendum result and they're just basically saying what this means is that we can erase Indigenous history and we can go back to this idea that everything that happened post-colonisation in Australia was absolutely amazing and brilliant. And sure, maybe some people suffered, but look where we are now. And I think that a lot of people who don't put a lot of thought into what that actually means for Australia, for Australia's maturity, are just all like, oh, I'm tired of thinking about this.
Yeah.
So let's just keep the date.
But it's a good reminder of how, I think, particularly on matters around culture war, social issues, important issues, it's not necessarily a one direction of progress, right? Like these things are contingent. They do move back and forth based on that kind of cultural conversation. And I think you're absolutely right that in the wake of the voice result, that's where things are at now.
Yeah, it absolutely is not linear. And so it's probably more important than ever that if you actually do care, that you do have as many conversations with people, as possible about why it's important to care. Because we're living in such a fractured time that if we don't find some way to create some sort of common ground with and I don't mean like your racist Uncle Bob, like there are some people who are just absolutely beyond it and no one should put themselves in unsafe positions. But we're kind of getting back to that point where people are hearing friends say stuff and letting it slide again because it just seems too difficult to actually, have the conversation. Have that conversation. It's important because I look at all the times that I've actually just been on like, well, why do you think that? And then try to have that person justify why they think it. And eventually you do see it when it kind of clicks if they're a fairly reasonable person where they realize they've basically been snowed. And so it's more important than ever that we actually start standing up for progressive beliefs and for the idea that we are actually all in this together. Because all power wants is for us to be as fractured as possible. That's literally the goal, is for us to be so overwhelmed, so inundated with compassion fatigue that we stop caring and we stop looking. And that means that they win. And like, fuck them, honestly. I refuse to let them win.
That was beautiful. I'm crying already at the start of the episode. Thank you, Amy Remeikis. That is the brain that we have access to. We're going to be running through the stories of the week with Amy to get her takes on the various comings and goings of Australian politics, particularly as an election looms. Just quickly, big shout out and love to our new patrons. Thank you for going to patreon.com/seriousdangerau and supporting the show. For just $3 a month, you get all the bonus content and you help us pay the bills. Thank you to Paleo, Eternal Supreme, Serena, Ben, No3BY4, I don't know what that is. A user's just called like a long dash, so they didn't even put a name on it. I think they're deliberately trying to fuck us up in this section of the show. Thomas, Laura, Phil, Liz, Melissa, Katarina, and Mark, thank you so much for helping us out. We really appreciate it. And thanks for being a patron. Our latest Patreon episode is a discussion about whether Australia is left-wing, right-wing, or in the centre, based on some recent research from Redbridge polling. That was a great chat, and you can listen to that if you are one of the chosen few as a Serious Danger Danger Dog. You can check out merch at seriousdangerpod.com. And also, we'd love you to give us a 5-star review. That helps spread the word, lets people know about Serious Danger. We got a little bit of coverage in the mainstream media about last week's episode with Lydia Thorpe, revealing that she's going to run again in the Senate in 2028. At least that's her current plan. And some organizations actually mentioned the name of our actual podcast. So the word is spreading, everyone.
Big leagues.
Big time. Big thanks, NITV. We appreciate it.
Oh, it's fine. It's cool. You can say that we are nothing, but you know the truth. And guess I'm the fool.
Okay, so we are looking down the barrel of 2 weeks of Parliament sitting. Is that right? It's 2 weeks. It's
1 week, and then we've got Senate and stuff.
And then the Senate. Well, who cares about the Senate?
Yeah,
but,
exactly.
No, yes.
Except for Lydia Thorpe and, all the people doing good work holding the government to account in the Senate. Thank you for that. But,
yes.
The rest of you, what are you doing?
Yeah. The rest of you don't come back. Just the progressive people, you can come back, actually. And then you guys get some shit done.
Yeah, exactly. I think that they sit Tuesday to Thursday, and then after that very, very, very big week, they then need to have a break because it's been very tough not sitting for the last few weeks. So the shock to the system means they need to go back and have another break.
Good Lord. So yes, there was discussion about whether or not this was actually going to happen, but yes, Parliament is going to come back, and the word is do that session, March budget, May election. What is your current read on the state of our politics as things start shoring up for that election? Obviously, we've already had policy announcements. The election campaign has essentially begun, of course. What's your read on the current vibes in Canberra and in #Auspol and your Remeikis?
It's a mess, isn't it? Like, Labor's just basically sleepwalking towards destruction. They've allowed Peter Dutton to completely set the election territory, the boundaries on which this election is going to be fought on. Yeah. Labor's story is basically we're going to keep tinkering around the edges of what we're already doing, but that's great because you would have been so much worse under the other guys. That's essentially what Labor is offering at the moment is things are bad, but just imagine how much worse they could have been, which is not exactly a good news story. It's not a hopeful story. It doesn't give anyone any kind of optimism that things will get better or things that will change. They're essentially just asking for a cookie for things not being as bad as maybe that they could. And it's really frustrating watching that. It's really frustrating watching Peter Dutton dictate the terms of the election. I mean, Peter Dutton has basically just set leadership tests for Anthony Albanese. Yeah. And Anthony Albanese just can't seem to help himself but try and meet every single one of the tests of leadership that Peter Dutton has set. It's like watching the mirror image of Malcolm Turnbull when he was the leader of the coalition and he just kept capitulating to the right with the idea that maybe that the right would eventually let him do something tiny on climate if he just kept giving them as much ground as they want. Anthony Albanese is essentially doing the same thing where he's just basically saying, okay, oh, sure, you're going to have this culture war. I'm going to try and diffuse this by just sort of kind of agreeing with you, but not actually saying anything. And then we'll leave that. That's settled. Let's move on to the next one without actually being able to communicate anything that they're doing. And while this government has been, I think, disappointing for a lot of people who may have thought that they would be better on integrity, on climate, on social justice issues, on actually reforming Australia's policies and actually being a progressive government. And I don't think anyone can say that they're a progressive government. While I think they've really disappointed a lot of people who believed in them, I think what's worse is that they have actually done some good things and they haven't been able to tell people what it is that they have done. They've done massive reforms in IR. The changes that they have made to, some of the settings in terms of the energy rebates and things like that actually have lowered inflation. I mean, we're going to get we got the latest inflation figures, so it's at 2.4% now. So that means that, everything that you're paying is 2.4%. We're about to do the indexation of things like childcare costs and, all of that other stuff. That's all based on the inflation rate. So all of that is going to be lower than it would have been without some of these policies that Labor has enacted. And you can see in some of the conservative press where they go, oh, it's an artificially lowered inflation rate. Well, that's the job of government is to lower the inflation rate artificially. Like, companies aren't going to just stop charging you more money out of the goodness of their hearts. Governments actually have to enact policies to make that happen. So yeah, it's artificial, but it happened because inflation was 8% and it's now 2.4%. So that's a lowering. So there are actually good stories with this government. There are terrible stories. I'm not denying that. But there are actually good stories that they've done. In terms of how they've been in the Israel-Palestine situation, Australia hasn't been as bad as a lot of other Western democracies. They haven't been brilliant, but they haven't been as bad. There are investigations into people who went to fight with the IOF. There are questionings and visas being denied for people who either have said abhorrent, like completely genocidal comments, or who have been in the IOF. Like, visas are being denied. Australia did call for a ceasefire before a lot of other Western nations. Australia has actually been pushing back quite hard against the Israel ambassador and things like that. Definitely not as far as they could have been, but in terms of Western democracies, Australia has done some moves. But they can't tell that story because they're terrified that if they tell that story, then they're just going to be accused of being anti-Semitic or once again allow Dutton to, do the framing that anything outside of wholehearted, full throttle support for what Israel and the Benjamin Netanyahu administration is doing is therefore being against all Jewish people everywhere, which is essentially the debate that Peter Dutton is trying to set up. So Labor doesn't tell any of the stories of what it has done. It's not able to tell the story of what it's doing in the energy transmission because it's afraid that it's going to be hit with, what about miners and their jobs? So you have Anthony Albanese doing mining tours in this faux election campaign where he's going to Queensland and the Northern Territory in Western Australia talking about how amazing mining is. In 2025, at the same time as the government is trying to transition to new technologies. It's crazy to me how quickly this happened, how basically this idea that you could just run a centrist government, middle of the road government, and try and win people's respect on the right, that they're suddenly just going to be like, oh, wow, maybe Labor are better managers of the economy. Oh, wow, maybe Labor actually do know what they're doing with power. Like, the truth never actually matters. People are just going to believe what they believe. And if they believe that the coalition are better managers of the economy, they're probably past talking to anyway when it comes to sense. So why are you governing for them and not for the people, the millions of people who wanted you to make changes in Australia that would make Australia better? It's insane to me. So when I look at the election scene, I'm like, the most likely outcome is a minority government, a minority Labor government, and that is a good thing, I think, because a strong independent crossbench actually means that there's going to be more work done on policy. And it does have to be remembered that Australia kind of often has a minority government because we very rarely have, the government in control of the Senate. So there's always negotiations that have to go on. That's just standard procedure in Australian politics. But there is a chance that the coalition will get there. It would take a pretty big swing, 6 or 7% across the nation as a nationwide swing, but they could get there. It would take 20 seats. Let's pretend Bradfield is the only seat that the coalition loses, Bradfield in North Sydney. That means that they would need 20 seats to win government. It's a hard ask, but if Labor continues on this path of not giving people any hope, of just sort of saying, we're going to do what we were doing, but slightly different around some of those edges, but we're not them, then it absolutely could happen. And that should scare people.
We had the Resolve strategic poll out this week. That's 52-48 to the coalition, so that's pretty standard. They're maintaining that lead there. But this polling also had questions around how people feel about the cost of living crisis and inflation. 54% of those polled said their wages haven't kept up with inflation over the past year. 50% expect inflation to get worse. Not a good sign. And 46% think their real wages will decline this year. That is, their wages won't keep up with that worsening inflation. So that's the vibe. As you said, there was this better economic news that, yes, ABS consumer inflation is sort of saying it's down to 2.4%, which is in the RBA's sort of target there. But that also means that prices are still going up, right? Like inflation is still a thing, and they're going up by 2.4%. They're going up by less than they were before, but things are already pretty crazy. People obviously already feel pretty bleak about the material conditions and how their wages are keeping up with stuff, and things that are going to keep up getting more expensive. At least that's how folks feel. So I do have some level of sympathy for a government in that position, or at least anything that you say to defend your record or anything you want to talk about it. But like, we've been doing all these things, inevitably leads people to the conclusion, well, you may have done all those things, but things still suck. I'm still going backwards here and things are so expensive and I don't feel good about the future. So I feel like they're pretty boned in that respect, at least. Talking about what's happened over the past 3 years or talking about the status quo, just don't think is going to cut through at all. They kind of almost exclusively have to be about, what are you going to do in your next term, right?
Yeah, that is true, and that's very generous of you, Tom. You're very
Thank
kind
you so
and
much. I'm a
generous.
very generous guy. But fuck them all.
You're absolutely right. And historically, when you look at Labor governments winning from opposition, they inevitably inherit like just fucked economic conditions. It's just like Labor government gets in Australia, global recession. Labor government gets into government in Australia, the inflation crisis left over from the pandemic hits. It always happens. Labor gets elected. Oh, great. It's World War II. This is basically the historical lump that Labor has had to take around. And by the time Labor has gotten through the pain and, set the economy up, people have just got the shits with their living conditions and they turf them out and they put in a coalition government who then basically reap the benefits of what Labor has done economically and just go, oh my God, look how much amazing things are now. We are incredible economic managers. You're welcome. Yeah. And that is one of the burdens, I think, when you do have slightly more, in this case, progressive policies than the Conservatives. I think the issue, though, is that when you talk to people, and I don't mean people who necessarily, follow politics as closely as you or I do, or even have the same beliefs as we do in terms of what should happen. People are turning against the major parties together. It's not like Anthony Albanese, I should make it clear, he's not particularly liked. His government isn't particularly liked, but he's also not hated. So it's not like people are just going, we hate that guy, we want to get him out, like there was with Scott Morrison. It's just people are just kind of like, oh, things aren't great. And when you say, yeah, sure, things are continuing to go up by 2.4%, it's also not taking into account the increases that are now baked in to our goods, particularly when it comes to energy and to produce and basics at the grocery store and fuel and things like that. We're never going back to the pre-pandemic prices. This is the price that we pay now, and the inflation kind of sits on top of that. And then that becomes normal, and then you have the next big crisis and things go up again. So there is a lowering of the standard of living for anyone who is not in the top 10% earners of Australia.
Mm.
But people are looking at Anthony Albanese and they're going, okay, well, you haven't made things entirely, or even better for me at all, particularly if you're on welfare. But then they're looking at the coalition and they're going, well, you're not exactly offering us anything either. So they're going independent and minor party. They're looking at independents and minor party. And we even saw that in the Northern Territory election where 3 independents were elected off major parties. Mm. And I think that trend is going to continue at this election. And the problem for the major parties is that they don't know where that vote lands for them in terms of the preferences. Does it come back to Labor? Does it come back to the coalition? Does it nudge an independent into one of those 1-2 positions where it's, they can take that seat from there? Because we often look at things, including polling, in 2-party preferred. But when it comes to those 3-cornered contests, we're not so good at working out where the vote is going to land if you have a very popular independent, which is why Nicolette Wooler can win Bradfield. It's why Alex Dyson can win Wannon. And there's a really interesting contest happening in Cowper as well, which is not getting a lot of attention. And so you're seeing people going, well, maybe independents can start working for me, because the polling and the margins in a lot of these independent communities are showing that, these are really slim margins and these are ones that potentially the Liberal Party can take back. But that's only if they get a swing in those seats, and it doesn't look like happening. So I just think that unless Labor comes up with some sort of story about what they are going to do in the next term that is going to make things better for people, unless they come up with a plan that is not following the US Democrats down into the hole of oblivion. I mean, I got a campaign email from Labor, which basically was, we can't go back, which was the Kamala Harris Democrat campaign slogan. We can't, we're not going back, or something like that. It was like, what are we doing here? Because unless they start
to
telling
a coalition government?
I assume that's what they meant. Yeah, I couldn't read beyond the subject line because I just was like, are you insane?
Like,
did you not see what happened? Are you living in an alternative reality?
Like Morrison's fucked off, so that's all done. All the hatred for Morrison's done.
We can't go back to people who were in the Morrison cabinet, I assume is what they mean. Yeah, anyways. But I was just like, where is the story? Because people turning to independents and minor parties, that is a good thing. People probably should be exploring the democratic options. But we're in a position where the coalition could also get to minority government if they win 16 seats or so. And there's, a few up for grabs in New South Wales, a few in Tasmania, a few in Victoria, a few in Western Australia, which, if the swing keeps going, could get the coalition there. And to go back to what we were saying earlier at the beginning of the show, sometimes it doesn't matter which hat you put on, the policies are the same. When you look at what the coalition is saying in terms of what they want to do for government cuts, in terms of what they want to do for diversity in Australia, these things are different. Compulsory voting has saved us. Compulsory voting has saved us from a lot of the worst of the populist politics, because we all hate bureaucracy so much and dealing with paperwork that we're all just go and vote rather than deal with getting the fine and then having to pretend that your dog had an emergency on voting day and you were unable to get to the polling booth. So compulsory voting does actually save Australia from a lot of the bullshit that we're seeing in Europe and the UK and the United States. And it does force the parties to mostly stick to the centre. But Dutton is widening that Overton window to the right in Australia. And people are feeling it. And that's not great.
People are mad at the salute that he did. Show what he did. And I'm gonna go into this because people are, I think they're off base.
Thank you.
Yeah, so people are mad at this gesture. All this gesture means is Heil Hitler. This is all this gesture means. This is a gesture signifying your support for Hitler. Hitler was a politician in Germany in the 1940s. People had varying degrees of, some people really liked what he did. A lot of people were not into it. And that's fair.
Let's talk about that in terms of the cuts. This was another big story from the week. The federal opposition has added a government efficiency portfolio to its front bench. In a further signal, the public service will be a key issue in this year's election. Opposition Indigenous Affairs spokesperson Jacinta Nabbajimpa-Price will take on the government waste role in the long-awaited reshuffle. Shadow Assistant Minister for Government Waste James Stephens has retained his role. Okay, so she's Shadow Minister of Government Efficiency. Some people have titled this SMOG in reference to the DOGE department that Elon Musk has taken over under Trump. Lots of people have been pointing out, hang on, you've got a shadow minister for government efficiency and a minister for government waste. That seems a little wasteful. And Dutton replied, there's so much waste in the system. Don't forget, the government spent an extra $347 billion. The government's employed 36,000 public servants in Canberra at the cost of $6 billion a year. So there is a broader role. James Stephens is doing an excellent job. Sounds like he's not doing an excellent job for government waste if they're adding
doing
more
such
people.
a great job that we're getting someone else to do the job as well.
Him and Jacinta will do a great job across government. They're two separate roles. So our argument is to bring that role, that function, into Prime Minister and Cabinet as a key central agency, and then to have the authority of Prime Minister and Cabinet to run the operation of seeing the efficiencies achieved across every department of the Commonwealth. Does that make sense to you?
Yeah, no, it doesn't. And it shouldn't make sense to anybody who can just, I don't know, that 1 and 1 equals 2. It does not make sense. In the final year of the Morrison government, it spent $20.8 billion on consultants. That's the equivalent of 54,000 public servants.
Great.
Because if you slash the public service, that work still has to get done, because it turns out that bureaucracy is, responsible for quite a lot in Australia, like health and transport and education and Centrelink and Medicare and veteran affairs and just, keeping the lights on and keeping people able to access their money and go to doctors and things. So, who knew that government services actually kind of important? So when you take away public servants, when you cut the public service, the work still has to be done. But what you do if you're the coalition and you want to say, oh, well, look how much money we have saved in the public service, is you publish those, documents showing, your $6 billion saving or whatever. But then you create essentially a shadow public service, which is made up of consultants, which charge a hell of a lot more than what the public service would actually cost you, and often includes people who used to work in the public service doing that job, but are now working for consultancies because they got sacked by the government, and now they're getting paid a lot more to do that same job that they were doing before they were turfed. And you just put that into a different budget item. And so you just go, oh, wow, we've saved so much money. Look at all of this waste, while you're spending 3-4 times as much money trying to fill those gaps. And one of the things that came out of the Veteran Royal Commission was the waiting times for veterans to actually access help and the impact that that was having on veterans and on families, because they were not able to get their claims processed so that they could access the life-saving treatment for their mental health or their physical health or whatever it is that they needed. And the reason that they couldn't access that help or have their claims processed is because there were not enough humans in the department to do it, because it had been cut. And so when we talk about cutting the public service, we're actually talking about cutting people's access to the services that they need to live in this country. Of course, there's waste in the government, like that's standard. there's waste absolutely everywhere. I mean, Peter Dutton also wants to give $20,000 tax write-offs for people to go have business lunches. Like, okay, cool. You can enjoy your Moet with your lobster. That's going to be a fantastic business lunch there while people are starving.
Well, actually, Moet is exempt. Alcohol is exempt from the policy.
Oh, sorry,
Just
you're
as a bit of a
right.
fact
You're
check.
right. God, they'll have to pay the $60 themselves, however they're going to do it. So, enjoy your snitty, your $20,000 snitty that you're having as a good working class Australian small business owner writing off your business lunch. So Peter Dutton wants to do that on one hand. And on the other hand, he's basically saying, I want to cut your services and I want to cut your access to services. And people who don't think about what these services do in their lives until they need them go, that's a great idea. That makes sense to me. And it's because we have spent decades painting the public service as these bloated bureaucrats who are just clock watching and not actually doing their job, when anyone who has to deal with a government department knows, A, how frustrating it is because there never seems to be enough people to do the job anyway. I mean, Services Australia has had an increase in public service, but you're still being hung up on when you call it to try and get something addressed because there's still not enough people to answer those calls. So they know how frustrating it is, but they also know how much work it takes for somebody to fix a bureaucratic fuck up, because it does take a lot of work. That is bureaucracy, that is government, and that is all of the different layers that they have to go through. So what Peter Dutton is saying is not that he wants to go, cut the different layers or make it easier for people to access services or, cut whatever. He's saying, I want to cut away the people who are trying to fix some of these fuck ups for you, and that's going to be great.
Yeah, well, Namajuba Price has certainly identified the stuff that she will be focusing on. This government has overseen a wasteful $450 million spent on the voice referendum, millions on the ineffective role of the First Nations ambassador, as well as those new 36,000 public servants. So they love that stat. They love wheeling that one out.
They do love that stat.
The coalition has already committed. Already committed to undertaking an audit of expenditure in Indigenous affairs for the very purpose of ensuring efficiency. I look forward to the complementary task of increasing efficiency more broadly and ensuring government priorities align with the priorities of everyday Australians. Now, as you say, yes, hey, there's got some government waste. You and I could identify some government waste. Maybe we could look at those fucking submarines that we're spending $368 billion on, or subsidies for the fossil fuel industry. That seems like pretty wasteful.
Yeah, that does seem pretty wasteful. I mean, there's also all the travel allowances that our politicians receive, to go to Canberra, and the rental allowances that they receive to stay in their own properties. Sure, let's go through and start identifying some of the government waste. Absolutely. But it is also very, very telling that the coalition is focusing in on Indigenous affairs whenever they speak about government waste, which is just furthering the myth that Indigenous people are getting absolutely everything, that they've got a free ride in this country. And, it's going to take a very serious government to have a look at that and just go, no, you can't have all of those houses and cars and very high paying jobs, Indigenous people in Australia, because we need to really look at what's happening here, when reality is, we all know what the reality is. We do not spend enough to ensure that our Indigenous people have the same quality of life that Tom and I do sitting in our houses. We know the overcrowding in houses. We know the poverty. We know that there is massive, massive gaps when it comes to health, when it comes to education, because we have an entire program called Closing the Gap, which is failing because we don't actually spend enough money in these very, very key areas, because we're too busy having culture wars over whether or not Indigenous people should even be allowed access to government services. It's completely fucked. There's nothing behind this policy other than racism, xenophobia, and trying to flood the zone with shit.
Yeah, I encourage anyone who thinks, Indigenous people, there's so much funding, we spend so much on this, doesn't do anything. Just go to some of these communities that we're talking about and just look around and go, yeah, just too many resources here. I think this community's just got too much going on here that they don't know what to do with, and that's at the core of their problems.
Yeah, and and if only there was some sort of oversight body made up of First Nations and Indigenous people who could actually direct where they thought that the funding should go so that it would be better targeted to bring the results that Indigenous people want for their own communities. Like, wouldn't that be a great idea?
No, that'll never work. What happened to that? Weren't they about regional voices? Wasn't there a period where they're we want regional voices, which is
regional
first of all,
voices.
another level of bureaucracy that presumably just Enterprise would come in and then abolish immediately once it was introduced. But what the fuck happened to that one? Come on.
Yeah. What happened to the second referendum? What happened to actually going into Indigenous communities and talking to people about what really mattered to them and what they were actually going to do. Yeah, exactly that. There is nothing behind these policies. It's just designed to take over the political conversation, and it's working. And that's what I mean when I say that Peter Dutton is setting the territory that this election is going to be fought on. It's not going to be fought on what actually matters to people in terms of improving their lives and improving the direction of Australia and improving our quality of life and our record when it comes to cutting fossil fuels and things like that. It's none of that. It's government waste and whether Australia Day should be on January 26 and whether trans kids should be able to have access to their own life-saving treatment and whether or not it's anti-Semitic to say, hey, genocide is pretty bad. Like, this is what we are fighting the election on. And I just kind of despair that we've just landed in this place so quickly. But it's the Tony Abbott playbook, so none of us should be surprised.
I think all this kind of, efficiency chat is very interesting. I think we see the same example in the US. Oh, we're here to reduce the size of government. We're all about government efficiency. Like Ronald Reagan was all about reducing the size of government. And then what do you know, at the end of the Reagan administration, the size of government has ballooned, mainly because of the military-industrial complex and the insane amounts of money that the US government and indeed the Australian government will pour into that area of things. So yes, AUKUS is a great example. The security state, never talking about reducing the amount of money that we spend on our military or surveillance or keeping that shit alive. No. That's all crucial spending that we need. But the real and the hundreds of billions of dollars that we've focused on that industry, that all needs to stay. But then we need to focus on shit like this, on the culture war point, as you mentioned. Jacinta Namatjira-Price says she'll look to stop federal funding for Indigenous welcome to country ceremonies if her party wins government at this year's federal election. Okay, so this is the thing she's identifying. This is the savings. We're spending $450,000 a government term, okay? So less than $500,000 every 3 to 4 years on this. This is the big savings that Jacinta Price is going for in a budget that reaches hundreds of billion dollars. I used to know off the top of my head, but in a $3 trillion economy with a massive government budget, this is where we're really going to be saving stuff. That isn't actually improving the life of a marginalised Indigenous Australian. That kind of funding could be redirected to actually improving the lives of marginalised Indigenous Australians, as opposed to being used for what is effectively a welcoming ceremony, many of which have now become quite politicised. I mean, there it is, right? That's the culture war debate, right? That's bringing together the wonders of government efficiency and shitting on First Nations people and their traditions. The very least that we could do is have a welcome to country ceremony for official events. But nope, that's going to go.
Yeah, but we should also be very clear that this is actually part of, and I know this sounds really conspiratorial every single time I say it, but the Atlas Network is real. You can look it up. And one of their key goals is to basically wind back Indigenous rights and First Nations rights in countries. It's happening in New Zealand with the bill to strip back the Maori Treaty, which I know isn't getting support, but we all know about it because how much attention did it get? Happened during the Voice referendum. It's happening in Canada. It's happening throughout, Scandinavian countries. It's happening in the United States. There is a concerted effort to wind back Indigenous rights, to make sure that we are all caught up in culture wars rather than actually forwarding anything that is going to help our First Nations people. and, basically get people to get their head out of their ass and do things to address our histories. And so,
So I genuinely don't. What is this Atlas Network strengthening the worldwide freedom movement? What is this? As a global right-wing crazy group of people that are actively campaigning and coordinating around this stuff?
Yeah, there is. And they've got all sorts of groups that are linked to them, including groups that are in Australia. And they actively get together and they work on this. So like when we talk about flooding the zone with shit, there is an actual like global coordination of this happening, across Western democracies. And basically every accusation is a confession, right? So whenever they're pointing at like their own anti-Semitic tropes of like, this global cabal that's controlling things, and they often name George Soros and his, beneficiaries and the funds in terms of the progressive things that he supports as being part of that. Well, it actually is happening. And I sound like a conspiracy nut every single time. I'm like, hey, the Atlas Network, have you guys heard of that? That's happening. That's a thing. And people are just like, oh, okay, Amy, you need to go lay down. But it is actually happening.
It's actually a thing. All right, that's very interesting. I'm looking at an ABC Listen article about who the Atlas Network is. So, and they were involved in the Voice referendum, were they? Well, they were certainly coordinating with the No campaign.
So, that's my gift to you, is just further despair as you realize just how closely linked all of this bullshit actually is.
Thanks, mate. Appreciate it. I mean, you sort of touched on it there, but I'm interested in, okay, so look at just the politics of this. Okay, so yes, I think that you can totally say there is real government waste. There are these weird examples that pop up every now and again that make people roll their eyes. I mean, the speechwriter salary for Bill Shorten, for example, is a story that got a lot of traction, which did seem quite ridiculous. Okay, so you've got all that, and you've got people, maybe your average punter, identifying their own examples of government waste that they see that pisses them off, okay? But as you mentioned, in the neoliberal era, the state has been hollowed out so much has been outsourced, and our ability to have a functioning government to provide the services that we need has been hacked away so much that people are so annoyed at the lack and the shitty quality of those services. And I don't think there's a majority support for putting less money into, say, public health or education, right? We know there's the widespread popular. So I guess, like, how does the politics of that shake out? How much can you appeal to people by saying we're going to cut government, focusing on the more ridiculous examples and the stuff that, you probably could get a lot of support for saying that we don't really need to be doing that, versus people's need, society crying out for a stronger state, a stronger welfare state to provide the services, because everyone feels like nothing really works anymore.
Yeah, but I think that's kind of how you do it, is by pointing out like the actual human impact that cutting services has. That the reason that we don't have a strong welfare state, or, a bureaucracy that actually is able to process claims or smooth the way for people, is by design, because it's been cut so many times in the past, and every single time it's cut, when, a Labor government comes in and puts more people into the public service directly rather than, rather into the military or into consultants, they never replace everybody who was, let go. They never do that, because they also need to, say that they're keeping an eye on government efficiency. And so it's just basically putting Band-Aids on the problem. But until we actually start looking at the role of government services in this nation and actually strengthening those institutions because they matter, and during the pandemic shutdown, I think we saw just how much the public service mattered, because you may remember our government didn't sit for some time, Parliament didn't sit, and yet the mechanics of government continued, because there were a bunch of people who were still turning up to work, who were processing claims, ensuring that people were getting their JobKeeper or whatever it was, processing the increase to the welfare payment, ensuring that that went out, ensuring that people were able to make it to testing centres, setting the testing centres up, working out how to get the vaccines across Australia. All of that was the public service. And we spend so much time demonizing the public service rather than actually celebrating what it could be and how important it is to Australia and and its democracy. Because one of the way that you undermine faith in democracy is just by creating a government bureaucracy that is so difficult to deal with that you don't want to deal with it. Like, I've had to deal with Centrelink plenty of times in my life, and there's been times where I haven't even bothered to go on a payment that I've desperately needed because the actual emotional and mental load of going through the bureaucracy to get what I need just didn't seem worth it to my health at particular points in time. So we actually need to start going, here is what it could be and here is what we have to defend, rather than constantly speaking about cuts. Because, that is the neoliberal project, but it's almost impossible to find a bulk billing GP in Australia at the moment because we're so comprehensively cutting into our health services. And every single time each government says we're increasing spending to health, we're increasing spending to health because the population is increasing. It's not because we're putting a huge extra amount. We're keeping pace with the very low level that we have set. Every single time that, you have a kid that goes through a public school, it's costing more and more money for parents, while at the same time, we're giving so many subsidies to private schools to do capital works. So you can have a private school in Sydney that can have a $125 million swimming pool at taxpayer, gratitude or whatever you want to call it, while you've got public schools that have been unable to get the mold out of the ceilings or, put in air conditioning or whatever it is that you need. Or basically, demountable shouldn't exist. There probably should be buildings that kids go into rather than dongers put up on some Besser blocks. There is ways to cut waste.
Yeah.
But there's also ways to ensure that we have a strong public service and strong institutions. And I don't know what the answer is other than to put everyone in a room and make them deal with a bureaucracy that has been cut.
Yeah, right, I guess. Well, this is it, right? Because obviously the coalition voter base is broadly, a bit more comfortable than everybody else. And
not anymore.
Well,
not anymore.
I know that's changing, but certainly the
the top end, the top end of town, which apparently you're not allowed to say anymore because that's discriminatory.
No, right.
And everybody's poor on $250,000. But the big earners, sure, they're still going to vote Conservative, but increasingly it's pensioners, it's people in the outer suburbs, it's the Nationals have some of the poorest people in their electorate in Australia. And they've bought into this idea that their lives would be better if they just cut the public service and they struck the welcome to country.
Well, yeah. Well, pensioners is a great example, right? So the coalitions know they can't piss off pensioners. So, of course, that's a part of
exempt
welfare funding that they're, very much hesitant to touch at all. But, Abbott's and Hockey's 2014 budget is a great example of just how toxic that kind of austerity mindset is. When they go mask off and they really try and pull that shit out, you can see the kind of public reaction to it. But there is a party that is actually interested in expanding the welfare state, actually doesn't give a shit about at least, restraining government spending because they think that spending money on stuff might make people's lives better, and that party is called the Greens. The Greens will urge the federal government to spend $8 billion over 3 years in rolling out 50-cent public transport fares nationally, taking spending promises made over the last month by the minor party to $95 billion. Greens leader Adam Bandt says expanding the policy, adopted in Queensland by both former Labor Premier Stephen Miles and his successor David Crisafulli, would save communities $2,400 a year in Melbourne, $2,160 in Sydney, $2,006 in Perth, and yada, yada. Anyway, it's going to save money. It would cost $8.1 billion in 3 years, according to the Parliamentary Budget Office. They're adding that. This is the AFR. They're adding that announcement to the $30 billion pledge for public hospitals, $40 billion for infrastructure funding for cities, and $10 billion to end public school fees and an annual $800 allowance for every child. So basically, Greens are saying, hey, let's spend lots of money. And yes, things have been hacked away. People are really struggling. Let's actually use the resources of this very rich country to redirect that wealth by taxing the rich and corporations and redirecting that to materially improve people's lives. Now,
And the Greens
lovely people,
and an economist a while ago called John Keynes had a very
There you
similar
go.
view. Yeah,
similar idea.
if the state takes care of the basics and necessities, then, the population are able to make choices about their lives. That's essentially the deal.
How do you think this kind of thing lands? I guess, as people are saying, yes, my cost of living's killing me at the moment. Then there is this narrative, of course, that we're drowning in debt and there's no money and the cupboard's bare. We can't possibly, do anything to redistribute resources. Again, I'm grateful that the Greens are there saying, no, that's bullshit. That's a narrative that's being sold to you by rich people, by the capitalists, by the political status quo.
You don't want to be taxed, but your income tax is increased, rather than taxing multinational billionaire companies.
Yes, taxing wealth. We could do all these things and we could do something. I mean, it's not even that fucking radical to try and say, hey, public education, which is supposed to be free, should actually be fucking free. How about that? Can we give that a go?
Yeah, how about that? Yeah, I mean, the 50-cent fare one, I fucking love that policy because when it came out, it was, when Stephen Miles said, this is what we're doing, it was absolutely rubbished in every single sector of the media, on talkback, this is insane. What are they doing?
Yeah.
This is going to cost the state so much money. It's absolutely ridiculous. And then, God, it turns out that people loved the fuck out of it and were using it so much that the Conservative government could not get rid of it, where they were like, oh, God, guys, you may not vote for us if we get rid of this. So we're going to do it too, because it improves people's lives. It's not even just the cost, right? You can go from Gympie at the northern end of the Sunshine Coast to the Gold Coast, on public transport. It'll take you forever because the train service up there is still absolutely abhorrent. But it'll take you, but you can get there for 50 cents.
Yeah.
So you can actually go and travel and see your state and go and see friends, and it'll cost you $1 in a return trip. The amount of people I know who were just going to the beach for the weekend because they could suddenly afford it. And, the quality of life just improved. And that is what government is supposed to do. It's supposed to improve your quality of life. And so we're going to see the same thing. The Greens go, okay, 50-cent fares, we should do that. Bit difficult because it's a state and territory thing and yada, yada, yada. But basically what they're saying is the federal government should be giving the states and territories money to put into their transport bodies to ensure that this can happen.
Yeah.
You're going to see the same people just being all 50-cent fares, that'll never work. This is pie in the sky thing. When it does work, it does. It's like when we doubled the rate of a job seeker, whatever it's called now, when the pandemic happened. People were lifted out of poverty. They were able to make choices about their life. It worked. It helped with people's mental health, with their physical health. People were able to access the services that they need to survive and have a good quality of life. We know this shit works, but
it costs money.
You don't do it,
Amy. It costs money
because of the culture war. Exactly.
We need to find a way. We need to find a way to improve the lives of 27 million people without spending any money. This is what we're trying to search for. You see, we want to spend as little money as possible to transform people's lives. The status quo sucks. Everyone agrees that the status quo sucks, but we can't spend any money in order to address that. Yes, discuss.
You know how we can address it? I've got it. We can just stop welcome to countries at all events, and then we can do whatever we want.
What about,
it's going to change
welcome
the
to
nation.
country, but we only pay the traditional owners 50 cents, okay? You only get paid 50 cents to do each welcome. That's all you're getting. How about that? We can save a lot of money that way.
The thing that really gets me about the welcome to country bullshit, about stopping the welcome to country bullshit, not the welcome to country itself, I need to be clear, just in case anyone wants to cut out one particular line from this podcast, is I don't have the figure in my head anymore, but how much money we spend sending out Australian flags and portraits of the king to whoever wants it. Every MP has to have king portraits and flags that they send out to whoever wants one. You just write to them and say, hey, give me a portrait of the king. We spend a lot of money on that too, but we don't hear anyone just going, we need to stop the king portraits. We need to stop sending out the Australian flag. You could just draw an Australian, print one out, save yourself, save the country some money. Like, it is absolutely ridiculous. And it just points to the fact this is literally just about a culture war.
Right. Well, I think sending people to the king, that materially improves their life. So that's different. Unlike
I think it's the tampon portrait too. You know, the one where he looks like he's in Game of Thrones, like he's just all in like completely draped in red. I think that's his official portrait.
Well, printing that in color would cost a lot of money too. Anyway, look, we're kind of out of time. I was going to ask you about the sort of the weeks ahead, but I guess we'll cover it on the show as we go into it, as Parliament returns and sort of what's on the agenda. But if you had any sort of last thoughts about what we should be looking for, future Made in Australia, this sort of massive tax breaks for onshore processing of critical minerals, which obviously there's some good parts of this policy. The opposition has labelled it billions for billionaires, which made me want to punch the wall. The idea that the coalition is now saying we can't give tax breaks and handouts to rich people. Come on. But I guess this is the small business.
Yeah, well, I mean, Gina Reinhardt will probably be a trillionaire by then, so it doesn't matter.
Yes, true. The nature laws are back on, apparently. Of course, we had this agreement between Tanya Plibersek and the crossbench in the Senate last year, said, yep, we're going to get these nature laws through. All agreed. And then Albanese got scared by the mining lobby and the WA Labor Party and came in and scuttled the deal. Once again, it's the Greens who are the wreckers and are constantly trying to undermine any progress happening and sabotaging Labor's agenda. But apparently they're going to have another crack at that. But also Albanese said, we're not going to change anything. We just expect the crossbench to support these laws without any amendments whatsoever, which I think will work out really well for him.
Democracy.
Yes, that's how democracy works. Gambling reform is not going to be on the agenda for these last couple of weeks. Nearly 6 months ago, the federal government presented a plan to introduce a cap of 2 gambling ads an hour on radio and TV. We talked about this on the show at the time, and a ban on adverts around or during live sport, including on social media. But significant lobbying from betting companies, sporting codes, and the media industry have stalled these plans. So it's not happening. Dutton's criticising Albanese for abandoning this too. Again, he gets to get political capital over Albanese saying he was going to do something and abandoning that. The weak narrative kind of does come through. Yes, again, that story is being told again and again. And the narrative, the story, the understanding of what this Labor government is about, what their priorities are, what they're prepared to fight for, and who their enemies are, and who they will and won't go to war with to fight for ordinary people to make this country a better place and wrest some control away from powerful interests, well, that all dissipates once again, it seems. Any final thoughts on all that?
Yeah. I think that's pretty much it.
Good. All right. I was pretty sure I was correct in every single way, but it's good to be confirmed.
Well, it is fucked, so yeah.
I guess, yeah, it'll be interesting to see. As we say, obviously, we'll get stories next week on the show as Parliament returns, and we'll see what's going down there. I mean, sincerely, I hope that there is some progress on the nature laws. There is some pressure coming from within the more environmentally conscious sections of the Labor Party wanting to see progress on this. You would hope that, the Greens and the crossbench could come to some kind of, actually progressive legislation around there that actually means that our nature laws will actually protect actual nature. And I hope they don't cave for the sake of not wanting to look obstructionist on this without getting any concessions whatsoever. But I guess, as we regularly say on Serious Danger, time will tell.
Time will tell, yeah. And you are right. It is 2 weeks of sitting. I just was being like, oh, God. Is it only a week? No, it is 2 weeks. And then a break. And then we go into Senate estimates. And won't that be an absolute delight?
That'd be fun. That makes it all worthwhile. Speak of government waste, am I right?
You have to stop the world just to stop the feeling.
All right, let's finish up with a call to action. Just want to give a shout out. Next Saturday, February the 8th, there are 2 by-elections in Victoria, and we have wonderful Greens candidates running. And please vote for them. That would be nice. Help them out if you can. If you're in a position to volunteer and you're in Werribee, the Greens candidate is Rifai Raheem, who has really deep connections to the local community. He's a trade unionist. He's been involved with the Werribee Islamic Centre. Vote for Mr. Raheem. That'd be great, and help out if you can, of course. and Prahan. We had Angelica de Camillo on the show last year. Of course, this is the Greens trying to hang on to the seat of Prahan, was previously held by Sam Hibbins before he left Parliament. She's an environmental engineer and renter. Maybe you could listen to our episode with Angelica if you want to find out more about her. But they are both on the ballot next Saturday, February 8th, and we are sending them love and solidarity and hope that they do okay. Any calls to action from your good self, Amy? Any causes you want to send people in the direction of?
Yes. I think everyone who hasn't paid attention, there's a pretty big important decision coming in Tasmania and Macquarie Harbour about saving the Maugean skate, which is basically a dinosaur fish. There's not many of them left, and they are at risk of extinction because of salmon farming. So Tanya Plibersek is under a lot of pressure from the salmon industry to not actually make any changes and stop salmon farming in Macquarie Harbour. So if you could lend some support to the decision around science and research and, save the poor little Maugean skate and also tell Labor that you care about this stuff, that would be great. And also just take care of yourself. Like, there is a lot going on in this fuckery of the world. So also just take time for yourselves to find little moments of joy.
Oh, we'll put a link to Environmental Tasmania's campaign to write to Tanya Plibersek to save the Maugean skate in the show notes. Thanks for listening to the show. Emerald will be back next week. We love you. Send us an email anytime, hello@seriousdangerpod.com. Follow us on socials @seriousdangerau. Amy Remeikis, thank you so much for joining us on the show again.
Thank you.
Bye.
Serious Danger Australia.